Hey everyone, this is Jeff Kanof, Vice President of Copperworks Distilling Company, here with another live tasting on a beautiful Friday afternoon. Well, at least it's afternoon here in Washington State. We've been flirting with sunshine all day. It's looking pretty nice right now. So we're going to be tasting release 33 of our American Single Malt Whiskey today. Brand new special release. Hey Jesse Spring, thanks for joining, man. Good to see you here online. I'll give everybody a couple minutes to jump in here before we get started with kind of the full scope of things. But yeah, feel free to ask any questions you have about Copperworks, about this particular release, about other recent releases that you've seen, anything on our page, or really anything at all. Bottles behind me, whatever you want to ask, please do. Definitely want to make this interactive, get as many questions as we can, make sure I'm talking about stuff you guys want to hear about. So I'm going to throw up, just while we're waiting for people to pop in here, I'm going to throw up a little photo. Don't have one of the bottle here, but here's a little photo of the barrel that was used for this release. So this is a Fino sherry barrel, single cask release. So we'll get into obviously all the details, but just wanted you guys to kind of see that barrel while we're waiting for some folks to join. Hey, Main Stem, I assume probably Phil. Hey, how's it going, man? Thanks for joining. All right, cool. Well, let's kind of kick into it. So I mentioned release 33 is coming from a Fino Sherry Cask. So I think the first thing I want to kind of cover, I always try to do like a little background on some topic, when we start some of these sessions. So, the first question when you talk about a sherry cask whiskey might be, well, what the heck is sherry? What are some of the details on sherry? How does it affect the flavor? So I want to just kind of give a little background on that. I'm certainly no expert on sherry. I've read my fair share about it. I've tasted my fair share of bottles, but we could probably do a whole session where we kind of invite an expert on sherry. That might be fun in the future. So send us a message if you think that'd be a cool idea. Hey Jorge, what's going on, man? Thanks for joining up. Miss you too. So sherry is a fortified wine from a specific region of southwest Spain known as the Sherry Triangle. So it's 3 different cities that are predominantly producing all the sherry in that area. And sherry is a really cool, interesting type of wine because it's such a broad range of wines. So a lot of people, when they think of sherry, they think about the sweet cream sherry that you add to a soup, because frankly, that's usually people's experience with sherry. But sherry can actually be super, super dry, light white wines, all the way to really, really kind of almost over the top sweet dessert wines. So kind of the driest style is Fino sherry. So that's the barrel type that was used for this release. That's through a process that's called biologically aging. And what that means is there's no oxidation occurring in the barrel. There's actually a layer of yeast that protects the wine in the sherry barrel and allows it to kind of age without the air affecting it too much. That layer of yeast is referred to as flor, F-L-O-R, and you'll hear a lot about that being talked about when you hear about sherry. The next kind of major style is called Oloroso, and Oloroso is fully oxidatively aged, so it's aged a lot more like a whiskey would be aged. In other words, you just put the wine in that barrel. It's not going to be protected by any of that natural yeast layer, and it's going to be affected a lot by the oxygen. So when you see an Oloroso sherry, it's brown. It's kind of a dark color, and that's because the air has gotten to it and helped during that aging process. And then talking about sort of the sweet side, you have Pedro Menez, which is a particular type of grape that's harvested in a certain way to make sure there's lots of sugar available, and then stopping the fermentation early. So it's very sweet. When you see it, it can be almost black in color. Really dark, rich, almost kind of looks like motor oil sometimes. Really nice to have as like a dessert, or even to use as a syrup, poured over some ice cream or something like that. Really beautiful stuff, but not the same by any means as like a Fino that you might have with an appetizer or a fish dish or something like that. There's some categories in between. I'm certainly not covering the whole gamut of sherry, but I just want to kind of give an overview. There are some sherries that are actually starting in the biological age, where they're aged under under that floor yeast layer, and then they actually fortify them to make sure that all dies off, and then they're actually aged oxidatively, more like an Oloroso sherry. So there's definitely all kinds of things in between. There's different types of sweet sherry. Obviously, I talked about that cream sherry category that a lot of people get familiar with first. But just know when you say sherry, it means a very broad range of wines. And then the other important thing is to think about the actual type of barrels and how they're used in the process. So some of you have probably heard of the Solera system. So these are usually pretty large casks, often like 500 liter, what's known as a butt in the industry. So about 2.5 times the size of a whiskey barrel. And what happens is you kind of have these layers of barrels in a Solera system. And so what you do is you bottle from the oldest barrel in the range. You take about 1/3 out of it and you put it into bottles and sell that product off as, you know, your Fino or your Oloroso or whatever style you're making. Then you take the next level, which is a little bit younger, and you move some of that whiskey to fill that bottom barrel. Then you go up to the next level, then you fill the amount that you took out of that second level, and then you put new wine, fresh wine, into that top barrel. So there's kind of an average age, you know, based on some math for each barrel. It's a very unique process to the sherry industry. There are definitely some people who are playing around with it in the American whiskey industry, which is kind of interesting. I'll tell you a little bit about this release. We kind of had like a partial accidental Solera that happened in making this whiskey, but certainly not intended and not anything like the advanced systems, you know, they kind of use over there in Spain to do the Solera. So it's a pretty cool process. It means that product is really aging for quite a long time before it hits your glass. And it also means these barrels are being used for a long time. So in other industries where you talk about barrels being used, like Scotch whiskey, you'll typically fill it, you'll age it for a certain amount of time, and then you will empty it. So this, you know, those barrels are in continuous use. So oftentimes they're used for generations, you know, 80, 90, 100, 150 years, basically until they're almost falling apart. So what's cool about that is, you know, when we get a barrel, it means it has this amazing history of aging that sherry in it. It's not just kind of a one and done quick thing. So a really cool product. Now that is contrasted with kind of a practice that happens a lot in the Scotch whiskey industry. So you might think, well, Jeff, I see a lot of Scotch that's aged in sherry barrels, but I don't actually see a ton of people talking about sherry or even drinking sherry. It's true that sherry has not been the most popular of drinks. Now it is with connoisseurs, and it certainly is with whiskey fans because they like to kind of see where that flavor comes from. But as an overall category, sherry is not nearly as popular as other styles of wines. Because of that, unfortunately, there sometimes aren't enough true sherry barrels for the whiskey producers that want them. So what happens is they'll take new barrels, they'll put sherry into them just for the sake of seasoning the barrels, and they'll put them in for anywhere 18 months, a couple of years, sometimes upwards of 5 years, just to make a barrel that has sherry flavor. Now it works. It makes a good flavor that can produce great single malt whiskey that has that sherry characteristic. But we always try to source barrels that were truly used in a sherry Solera system. We just think it's a little more authentic to the entire process. And frankly, we think it tastes quite good, and we kind of want to learn about those real flavors rather than sourcing some of those kind of seasoned barrels. Again, not that there's anything wrong with that process, in the words of Jerry Seinfeld, not that there's anything wrong with it, but we kind of go for the real deal. But it's an interesting thing to note. It's one of these things that's kind of a little bit of a half secret. It's pretty widely known, but a lot of people that drink Scotch, you know, wouldn't necessarily have a reason to know that. That said, that's kind of a little background on sherry, how the barrel system works in sherry, where we get them from. Let me know if you have any questions about sherry. I'll do my best to answer them. Like I said at the beginning, I'm definitely not a sherry expert, but I know a little bit. I've read some books about sherry, and obviously have experience using the barrels to make whiskey. So I'm going to get into this a little bit. So this is release 33. It's going to be a little backwards on your screen. So it's made from pale malted barley, so kind of our most traditional of recipes. And then it is aged in a Fino sherry cask, like I mentioned. So that's kind of the easy story. It is a little more complicated. So the way we actually made this particular barrel was we took about 85 gallons of whiskey that was already aging in a used cognac barrel for just over 2 years, and we filled it into this barrel. There was still some headspace in the barrel. In fact, there was about a third of headspace in the barrel. So what we did was put brand new whiskey, so what we call new make whiskey from the same pale malt recipe, into that barrel to top it off. So the minimum age in this barrel is 30 months, but truly 2/3 of this barrel was aged, I'm going to have to do math here, about 4.5 years. So most of the whiskey in here is significantly older than that 30-month period that you'll see on the label. But the minimum age, because we added a third of new make whiskey, is 30 months. So that's what I was hinting at earlier, where we kind of did an accidental Solera. In reality, we just did that for practical purposes. We knew we were going to have something nice in that barrel eventually, so we didn't mind adding some younger whiskey in there to make sure we could use all the space in the barrel. Frankly, we wanted to do a Sherry Cask release. We knew we had a lot of barrels in our warehouse. We've got somewhere about 15 to 18 Sherry Casks, and they're quite big, as I mentioned. So it's more like the equivalent of 40 to 50 regular whiskey barrels. So we knew we wanted to do a release. We actually searched through about 9 of those that we thought, might have a flavor profile we're going for, just based on looking at them on paper. We narrowed that down to about 3 that we presented to the entire team, and then we got to this one, which is barrel 274. And frankly, we didn't even realize that it had gone through that process 30 months ago, where we added the new whiskey when we picked it. So a lot of times at Copperworks, you'll hear us talk about how we lead everything with flavor first. We don't usually think about the economics. We don't think necessarily about how amazing of a marketing story it is. So this is a really good example of that. We didn't realize how hard it was going to be to tell that story of how we had some aged whiskey, we moved it into a barrel, we topped it off with some other whiskey. All we knew is we really enjoyed the barrel, and we wanted to put it out for you guys to have as release 33 of Copperworks American Single Malt Whiskey. And then actually after the fact, we realized, that's kind of a weird process we did to go for this particular whiskey. So because it was a third, that's why I said it's kind of an accidental Solera, because that's typically the amount of volume they'll remove from the bottom barrel and then top off the top barrel. So that's kind of a happy accident, definitely not intentional by any means. I wish I could say it was. So this product, like I said, pale malt recipe. So what you're really seeing here is not necessarily kind of an interesting beer recipe like sometimes our products are. You're actually seeing the Sherry Cask really sing through. So we've had a lot of releases, 4 or 5 releases that have some Sherry Cask whiskey in it. But typically, I think our max we've ever done was 10%. Sometimes as low as 5% of the whiskey in the bottle, and then sometimes in between. So that is more where we're using the sherry to get a balance of flavors. This one, we were trying to release something that was more like a sherry bomb, where you're really getting those intense sherry flavors, where you can really see what that wine that was in the barrel previously gives to the product. So we think we came out with something really nice. So I'm going to kind of get into tasting it. This just came out, by the way, yesterday. It came out about a week ago to our First Cut Club members, and then yesterday to the public. You can get it on our online store. You can also pop into our shop Tuesday through Friday. We're doing pickups 2 to 4. We're still closed for tastings, unfortunately, but we are doing pickups of spirits. So this one, 594 bottles, because like I said, it is about 2.5 times the size of a regular whiskey barrel. So it will, extend a little bit further. That said, our last single cask was sold out in, I think, less than 2 weeks, maybe less than 1. So definitely, if you're interested in this one, pick it up because it probably won't last long. I'm almost certain it won't last through the holidays. So if you're looking at gifts, if you've got a sherry whiskey fan in the family or a friend, make sure you pop on and get one of those now. But let's get into tasting it. First thing you'll notice, if you were to compare this to one of our other whiskeys, which I guess I have a bottle here of release 31, and I have an empty glass. So I'm going to see if you can kind of get the difference over the video, but certainly if you have it in front of you at home, you'll be able to see the difference. Now remember, I said that Fino, unlike Oloroso, hopefully I can get the feeling here. So this is the Sherry Cask. You can see it's a little bit darker, kind of reddish hue to it. This one's all new American oak. That's release 31, which by the way is still available. little bit lighter. So the sherry, being soaking in there, kind of oxidizing on its way over, is going to get a dark color, even though the pheno isn't oxidatively aged. So a lot darker color. So right off the bat, before you even smell or taste it, you're going to notice a difference in this Sherry Cask whiskey. By the way, this is bottled at 100 proof, 50% alcohol, so it's not a cask strength. We find the cask strength on some of the Sherry Casks can be a little too aggressive, and we always want to put in the bottle what we want to present to you. So we definitely give some headway to add water, some ice, but we never want to, put a cask strength just for the sake of it. We always do cask strength when we think that particular barrel presents itself well at cask strength. So getting into this one in the nose, you're definitely getting kind of nutty aromas, almond, like a fruit cake, quite raisiny in character. A lot going on, because you also still have some of kind of like the typical aging, baking spice, vanilla, things like that. On the palate, definitely get kind of like a fig note, some kind of dark fruit for sure. A little bit of like citrus rind. I personally get a lot of like kind of balsamic vinegar notes, kind of that similar kind of like long aged product, kind of rich, kind of dark, sweet fruit, kind of like the figs as well. I just added a couple drops of water. I definitely recommend tasting any whiskey, even if it is kind of the strength the distiller likes it. It can be nice to create that little break in the alcohol and water by adding a few drops. Sometimes a lot more aromas come out. Getting some like apple skin, some brown butter. Definitely some citrus notes, which are pretty characteristic of Copperworks. Not as much in this as I would in one of our standard releases. But really, yes, definitely focusing on kind of that raisiny, that nuttiness. Definitely kind of like almost like a rum cake, like a soaked cake with some kind of alcohol. Really, really nice there. Really sippable. I would probably recommend you mostly drink this on its own or with an ice cube if you like doing a single ice cube. That said, in this series, I always like to talk a little bit about cocktail ideas because, frankly, I know not everybody just sits down with glasses of whiskey and drinks them. I like sitting with a glass of whiskey, but I love cocktails as well. For something like this, it does have enough of the sherry character that it will pop out no matter what you make from it. So even if you kind of wanted to go citrus forward with a drink, I'd probably start with lemon for this one. You will taste that sherry note, which will be quite nice. That said, I probably would stick to more of a spirit forward cocktail. This one kind of jumps out as, an interesting take on a Manhattan, where you might want to try replacing some of the vermouth with a sherry. So maybe go with a sweeter style if you've got a Pedro Menez sherry, maybe Oloroso. So kind of play that up a little bit. To be honest, I haven't tried it yet because this is such a new product. Maybe I'll try one tonight. But it seems to me that if you kind of play up that sherry note a little bit more, I'm guessing you liked the sherry note or you wouldn't have bought the product. So it'd be a really nice way to kind of make a cocktail with it, but really still emphasize what's special about it. I might also try a Boulevardier, which is basically a Negroni but with whiskey. I think the sherry notes would go really well with Campari. Again, you could take some of the sweet vermouth in Negroni and replace that with a sherry, kind of whatever you might have on hand or whatever you can find locally pretty easily. Play around with that a little bit. So, the cool thing about both of those cocktails, Manhattan and Negroni, you can think of them, I think I've mentioned this on past videos, think of them as sort of like a template, like a Mr. Potato Head, where you can take out certain parts and pop in other parts. Same thing, a Negroni is a base spirit. It's a aromatized wine like sweet vermouth, and then it's an Amaro like Campari. You can change any of those products. So obviously we're talking about release 33, so you'd use that as your spirit base. Maybe you want to stick with Campari because that's what you got, but then maybe you change out the wine for something else. So instead of a sweet vermouth, again, you try the sherry. Maybe you try some other herbal kind of liqueur you have around. You could really play around with that. Negroni is a cool one because it's equal parts cocktail, so it's very easy to make those substitutions and just mess around with it and taste it. And because it's equal parts, you can make one that's a quarter ounce, a quarter ounce, a quarter ounce. You can make a little mini cocktail. If it's no good, hey, move on, try another one. Or even if you're playing around with some family members at home, make them a little flight of 3 different Negronis, all using the Sherry Cask whiskey, mess around with it. So I'm going a little tangent about cocktails, but I know people like to hear about cocktails a little bit. Same thing with a Manhattan. You can make a little mini version. On that kind of note, this isn't exactly a cocktail idea, but you might want to do like a little mini flight. Maybe it's, just 2 whiskeys. So instead of just pouring a neat pour of this one, do like I did and pour one of Copperworks standard releases, or even like an iconic scotch that has a sherry note to it to kind of compare it to, sort of a new world take on that from Copperworks. So it can be fun to not only taste whiskey, but taste, 2 or 3 side by side. I tend to recommend going like 3, 4 max. If you start tasting more than that, it gets pretty overwhelming, and you're probably just struggling with it on your palate a little too much. But try that out. So those are kind of my ideas for using it in cocktails, drinking it at home. Again, I'd probably say the best way to drink it is just on its own. Feel free to put a little water in it, put an ice cube in it. But let us know, chime in on here if you've got any ideas. Or send us a DM if you got a cocktail idea with this spirit or any of our other spirits. I'll stop here. If anybody has any questions, let me know. If you got a question about sherry barrels, this release in particular, a past release, I can answer kind of anything you got. Also, you can send us a DM with questions. If you're more of an email person, you can email us, info@Copperworks Distilling. Reach us on Facebook, Twitter, kind of anywhere you are, we hopefully are. And if we're not, send us a message somewhere else and tell us to get our butts on some new platform. So with that in mind, I kind of covered what I was hoping to. Like I said, this is a 594 bottle release, so very limited. We not necessarily going to always keep a sherry cask in stock, so if you are interested in that, I would jump on it. The last one, like I mentioned, last single cask sold out in just a few weeks. Again, it's store.copperworksdistilling.com. If you go to our profile on Instagram, you will see that. We're going to continue to do these videos. Please share them, like them, bookmark them, tell your friends we're doing them. Next week, Jason is going to be back with more production. By the way, if you missed his session on barrels last week, that was a good one. You can watch that on Instagram TV or on our YouTube channel. Next week, Jason's going to be talking about blending and proofing. So when you think about not a single barrel like this one, but some of our other releases that are a combination of barrels, he's going to kind of cover how do we choose them. How do we go in and pick the 6 or 7 or 8 barrels that we use in that blend, and how do we choose that it's 100 proof or 95 proof or cask strength. So that should be a really fun one. It's kind of the end of the production process, so to speak. And then we're going to kind of dive into some, other topics. Like I said, give us ideas if you got some topic ideas. But otherwise, we will see you next week. And then I'll be back in subsequent weeks to talk about some more products. So I don't see any questions coming in right now. Thanks everyone for joining. Again, like, share, go check out the products on our store, visit your local retailers and pick up some of our products. Appreciate the support, and we will see you next week. Thanks everyone. Cheers.